in the debate last week or whatever it was, you had a position on busing, and I'd like to hear where you stand after you know, not in the heat of the debate.
Yeah, I mean, the question, yes, of course, thank you. The question was, how do I feel about busing? That it came up during the debate, and where do I stand, and can we talk about it not in the heat of a debate? So, you know, I think you all know the context in which it came up, which is there was a discussion about former members of the United States Senate who were proven to be segregationists, who had a history and really pretty much lived their careers and their reputations off of that history of fighting against the integration of the races in our country. And their work included fighting against integration of our public schools. Back to Brown v. Board of Education. The reason that the United States Supreme Court, that the case of Brown v. Board of Education went that high, was because this was such a contested issue in our country. There were laws in place and leaders in place who fought for the segregation of the races as it relates to public education. This is part of the sad history of our country. We have a lot to be proud of, and then there is a lot that we should not be proud of, and this is one of those things. So it had to go to the United States Supreme Court. And then, you know, I'll say this with a point of personal pride, you know, a former Attorney General of California, Earl Warren, who went on to be the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, knowing how important the subject was, as really integral to a statement about who we are as a nation and our principles and ideals. You'll all remember that part of the history of that case was Earl Warren said, this is a case that is so fundamental in terms of a reflection of who we are. It is critically important. It's a unanimous decision. So if you read the history behind the case, he pushed that there would be that unanimous decision, which there was, to integrate the schools of California, to integrate the schools of our country. Okay, fast forward to almost 20 years. I am a first grader in Berkeley, California public schools. 20 years. Now, this is Berkeley, California, right? It's not what you might imagine. You know, people think of it as being a progressive place, right? In Berkeley, California, I was only part of the second class to integrate Berkeley schools. This is the reality of how all that played out in our nation. Which is, it didn't just, you know, in 1954 it got decided, and then all of a sudden a key was the thing was unlocked. There had to be policies and pressure in place to actually fulfill the promise of Brown v. Board of Education to integrate the schools of our country. People were resisting it, violently resisting it. And we can all remember the images in particular from the South, violently resisting the desegregation of our schools. So what else had to happen? They had to be put in place then, mandatory busing. Berkeley was not one of the places, they did it voluntarily. But in places around our country, mandatory busing had to be put in place because there was such resistance, even violent resistance, to the integration of our schools. So on the subject of mandatory busing in our country and what was going on during that era and that place and time, yes, I believe that was exactly what was necessary. One of my opponents in this race, still to this day, disagrees that was necessary. I don't want to speak for him, but I do know he and I have a disagreement on that issue. And we're going to have to agree to disagree. When we talk about where we are today, because that's been part of the question that is being asked, there's no question, and I think the educators among us know that even today, we are seeing extreme segregation in our schools. And, you know, there are a number of reasons for it, including, if we're going to have a candid conversation, that after Brown v. Board of Education and the integration, the enforced integration of schools, there were certain families that said, I don't want my kids to be educated with black kids. And people started pulling their kids out of the public schools. And you can kind of loosely track also resources being pulled out of those schools. And so if you go into the public school system of many states in our country, you will see extreme segregation by race. Now, what we're seeing now is not a function of people in state houses and legislatures who are resisting integration. The reason is different. So for that reason, I say, mandatory busing is not what's going to deal with what we have right now. what we need to deal with right now is the fact of it, and so I have a number of ideas about how we need to do it. One is we just need to track it and keep the statistics about, we need to keep statistics about race. We need to look at what's going on around, gerrymandering on a number of issues, including who can live in what districts, and what kind of school boards they get as a result of that. We need to look at what we need to do to encourage, from a federal government perspective, supporting public magnet schools, right? So there are a number of solutions to this. Busing may be one of them, but not the kind of mandatory busing that we saw then, because it's a different circumstance.